Joining us today, who are able to speak to different policy advancements, both within the state and around the country, and also just the simple importance as to why we should be all convening today to discuss sustainable aquaculture and the difference that this industry can make, both in the economy and in our lives and the health of our oceans. So to begin, I'm first going to ask each of our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves, and then we will go into a series of questions with the panelists and walk through a bit of a moderated conversation. And then we plan to have Q&A starting at about 3:45 today, so the audience is able to ask questions directly to the panelists. Please, at any point during the conversation today, feel free to drop questions into the chat or into the Q&A box. And if we can insert them throughout the moderated discussion, we will. If not, we will turn to them at about 3:45 when we turn over just to Q&A from the audience after the moderated discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves in turn. And I'll begin with you, Peter, as you've already come off mic ready to go.
Thank you, Jade. Appreciate being here. My name is Peter Adame. I'm the Director of Communications and Sustainability for Loose America Foods. We're a West Coast seafood wholesaler, processor, and distributor, and we have facilities in Seattle, Washington, Northern California, and down in LA as well. So we distribute seafood to the whole West Coast, and we have a dock in Monterey Bay, California as well. Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Peter. We're glad to have you. Terry?
Hi, I'm Terry King. I work for NOAA Fisheries, and I am a regional aquaculture coordinator for the West Coast region. And I am up here in Washington State, and I cover both Washington and Oregon. And I've spent my career working on aquaculture issues, technology, and things like that. And I'm really excited to be here at NOAA to continue aquaculture and how we can support it.
Thanks, Terry. And Mark?
I'm Dr. Mark Gold. I'm currently the Director of Water Scarcity Solutions at the Natural Resources Defense Council, but that's not why I'm here. I'm also an adjunct professor in UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, and I'm the former Deputy Secretary for Coast and Ocean Policy for the state of California and the former Executive Director of the Ocean Protection Council. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Mark. And again, very glad to have you. So we'll just go ahead and jump right in then to our sort of moderated discussion with our panelists. And the first question is really going to help us take a step back and I think sort of ground ourselves before we jumped into policy. First, I just wanted to ask each of the panelists in turn to explain why they feel it's necessary to get sustainable aquaculture policy right. Why is sustainable aquaculture such an important industry that it's worth us all taking an hour out of our day today to chat about the policies that impact it? And Peter, I'm going to start with you on this question.
Great, thank you. Well, I mean, as a seafood company, we're always looking for more sources of this healthy protein that we can distribute to companies. You have experts here that can probably speak to this better, but from my understanding, it's pretty complicated for aquaculture operations to get started at the state level. And then at the federal level, there really isn't a framework that we have in place, not like we do with wild fisheries management. And because of this, it has put a hindrance on what kind of domestic products we have available. Again, I look to our California coast and we have groundfish that is doing really well and has bounced back thanks to good federal management, but we're not seeing that with aquaculture. And I believe the US is 17th or 18th in the world right now. And if the US embraces aquaculture in a responsible way where we can set up good regulations like we do with wild fisheries, the US can be a global leader for sustainable aquaculture.
Thanks, Peter. Terry, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I would just like to echo what Peter said. I mean, we're at 18th in global aquaculture production. We consume in the US a lot of seafood and we're importing most of it. And there are things that we can do wisely, sustainably to, create a domestic aquaculture, farms, products. And we have a lot of them out in the States now, and we can do even more. because we have an insatiable appetite for seafood in this country, and we need to help with that. And NOAA has certain certain rules and things that we'll be watching for as these things are developed, and we'll get to that later. I'm sure we'll talk about those, but we're serious about helping increase the seafood supply, both from wild fisheries and from aquaculture that we can. We have a limited resource, so let's see what we can do in terms of culturing seafood.
Thanks, Terry. And Mark?
Yeah, just to add, and sort of with a California-centric viewpoint, California doesn't have a systematic approach to aquaculture at all, and so that's something that is in the process of changing. But it's one of the reasons why we don't have a very robust program. It's sort of one-off, from the standpoint of one application at a time and getting things done. There are no large-scale objectives of what to achieve, and because we're California, we need to be a sustainability leader nationally. We want to do this in a way that's not going to add to, for example, pollution in the marine environment, whether that's increased nutrients or plastics or microplastics from aquaculture done poorly, siting properly, making sure that we're doing aquaculture in the right places. And then there's the policy for the state of California, which is not, it's a temporary policy. It might not be permanent, but the point was to do it right. Let's focus on being, growing the markets, growing the sustainable aquaculture in shellfish and algae, because those have the least marine impacts. And so those are areas where there's definitely a lot of growth, and that's in the marine environment. It doesn't mean you can't do finfish on the land side, and I'll address that a little bit later.
Thanks, Mark. Turning now a bit more to the discussion on policy impacting sustainable aquaculture, which you've all already hinted at a little bit. Terry, I'm going to ask you to respond first. How do current policies, and maybe you can pick the jurisdiction that makes the most sense to reference, but how do current policies impact the trajectory of this sector?
Sure. So for NOAA Fisheries, our federal what we need to do at NOAA Fisheries is protect our trust resources, be it a fishing or in aquaculture. And the things that we're looking at are Endangered Species Act, any listed species, making sure that whatever operation goes in is not going to harm or cause impact to that or a further taking. Looking at marine mammals and making sure that our, the trust resources, the marine mammals are, not impacted by whatever operation is going to go in. Looking at essential fish habitat, so that something that an aquaculture operation might be doing, be it seaweed or fish or shellfish, that it would not be impacting negatively essential fish habitat. Many times it's going to be enhancing. We've also got corals and sponges that we're required to protect, and we'll be looking at as part of our mandate, any federal fish stocks and the socioeconomics of aquaculture as a whole, for our communities, etc. And then one of the things that folks often forget about is National Marine Fisheries Service has a lot of scientific surveys. And sometimes, a fishing fleet or, an aquaculture operation might be going in a prime area where we have scientific surveys going on, and that's not going to be a compatible use. So those are some of the things that you kind of have to, weed around when you're looking for that prime spot. And as Peter said, not every species is going to grow in that location. You've got to pick the right plant or the right species in the right location to have the animal healthy and wholesome as well.
Thanks, Terry. Mark or Peter, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd be glad to, sort of giving people the California framework on where things are and where they're potentially going. We don't have a California Aquaculture Action Plan. We were supposed to have one by 2023. Right now, it's looking more at 2025 or so. And that's a bunch of different agencies at the state: Ocean Protection Council, Fish and Wildlife, Fish and Game Commission, State Lands Commission, State Department of Public Health, Coastal Commission, et cetera, working together and putting that and making that happen. And the goals of that plan would be to improve California aquaculture governance and the framework through increasing interagency coordination and transparency, as well as to ensure environmental sustainability and public safety, to make sure, safe food products, as well as not causing biodiversity threats is a big issue. And then identifying pathways to facilitate expansion of sustainable mariculture. So those are the things that are in there. The principles that were put together in 2021, which is the interim of how the state is operating, there's 7 guiding principles, including vision statement and goals. And the vision statement itself touches upon a lot of the issues that Terry just brought up. Coordination with tribes is a very, very important component of that, not impacting things like marine protected areas, et cetera. But the principles themselves, really common sense, but it helps to get all the agencies sort of thinking in the same way, is to develop and utilize the best available science for aquaculture, ensure aquaculture sustainability, build governance and management partnerships, ensure effectiveness of aquaculture planning, develop and implement efficient aquaculture oversight, and finally, protect public health and safety. And you got to do it in a way with a sustainable funding measure. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of the obstacles are later. But I would like to say that even with the lack of a completed policy and action plan in place yet, we're still seeing some progress in the state. And some of that is Fish and Game approved their public interest determination criteria for aquaculture leasing. And so we're actually potentially in the next year or so, maybe less, we'll see a new lease in Tamales Bay of 40 acres for shellfish and seaweed, San Andreas shellfish. That would be the first new lease in 30 years if that gets approved. So that shows you what we really need to do to improve, because we're really not adding a lot new in that regard. Another one is, you heard me talk about the importance of protecting the marine environment and maybe looking at it slightly differently on land. And in that regard, and I'll stop after this, is you have Nordic Aqua Farms, which has received a coastal development permit from the Coastal Commission recently, I think back in May. And that's on the Humboldt Bay area. And it's for yellowtail. So that is a finfish aquaculture, not salmon. That was highly controversial in light of the collapse of wild salmon populations within the vicinity. And this would, upon full build out, 25,000 metric tons per year of yellowtail, 2,000 to start. And so it does show you that there has been some progress. There's more things going on than that, but those are just a couple of things that the audience might be curious about.
Thanks, Mark. Peter, and just give you the final word there around again, just how current policies are impacting the trajectory of sustainable aquaculture at the moment.
Thank you. In my role, I really am focused on helping to meet our customers meet their sustainability goals, whether that's a big grocery store chain or a food service company. And as Terry pointed out, we're importing the vast majority of our seafood. So I'm trying to reduce our mileage when it comes to food. And one thing we did as a company to try to get more involved with the process, just because we are, at the end of the day, a seafood company, we joined a coalition. So it's called the Coalition for Sustainable Aquaculture, or the CSA. It's pretty new. It's been around maybe 2 years, I think now. And it's a cohort of some leading chefs, environmental groups like EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, and a couple other industry leaders. And it's been really cool to learn more from some of these policy experts on things that we can do. And so recently I had the opportunity to fly to Washington, DC with some of my cohort, and we were pushing for the Seafood Act, which is the Science-Based Equitable Aquaculture Food Act. And it's really pushing for aquaculture here in the US, but not in a rushed approach. Rather, it's trying to make sure we do the research first. As both Terry and Mark have noted, obviously aquaculture can be controversial. It can have issues that we need to be mindful of. But this group wants to make sure we're doing it right, like what we're doing with our wild fisheries. So if we can get legislation like the Seafood Act that can mirror that, where it has safeguards in place, not only for the environment, but also the communities that are going to be impacted, how can we make it equitable? The Seafood Act checks a lot of those blocks for us, and we've had the opportunity to speak to some of our congressional representatives about it, which was really exciting.
Awesome, thanks for sharing. Yeah, we're getting into kind of the solutions side of the conversation. And again, it's just great to see there is already so much momentum being built in this conversation around bringing sustainable aquaculture to the fore. And you've all sort of hinted a bit in different ways that one, you know, not just California, but the United States is a big importer, right, of seafood and seafood products. And so I think part of that stems from, you know, there are so many competing uses for our oceans, and not the least of which is, of course, that the ocean supports a lot of life, both below and above water. And there's so many concerns around how anyone, you know, who's putting any sort of infrastructure in the water is doing that and ensuring that we're weighing all of the implications of that type of activity in our oceans. So I was hoping that, and you've already all sort of hinted at this a little bit, but I want to get very directly to it. You know, what really are the key policy challenges that have, you know, we've gone to this place where we're eating seafood, you know, we're using the plants, but we're importing them. What are the key policy challenges that, you know, the growers, the farmers are facing in helping to domesticate this industry and bring, you know, increase the productivity of seafood, sea plants in the United States? And so I'm going to start this with you, Mark, actually.
Okay, Jade, I will not give the grower's perspective, but I will give more of the former regulatory perspective as well as the environmental community perspective, which is from the state's perspective, and this became really clear with the meetings and putting together the sustainable aquaculture principles. There's not enough money to run a good program. It's not even close. And if you start doing the math on what you'd have to charge per permit for new aquaculture, no new aquaculture would ever get off the ground. And so unless there's going to be some subsidy, the same way we see subsidies of agriculture on a daily basis, this is a major problem. And so you look in the state of California, and whether that's someone like a BizFed, or, you know, whether or not you partner with CDFA, Food and Ag, because they're used to doing this sort of thing a lot more than the ocean managers are. I'm not sure what the right answer is to that, but I can tell you right now, there just are not the resources to manage this properly, to have independent monitoring programs in place to make sure that we're not causing pollution problems, not having pathogen outbreaks, not having invasive species issues, entanglement issues with marine mammals, all those other sorts of things that we're super concerned about. And that to me is a big concern. And it's an impediment that can be overcome, just like the lack of a policy, which I've spent, you know, the last 2 times talking about here. That's something that is on the way to being fixed. And I just hope that the state follows it all the way through and provide some funding for policy implementation, because that would be another thing that would be incredibly helpful to do that. But we need a standardized siting, we need standardized approach, standardized monitoring approach. We need much better interagency coordination. We want to make sure that we're protecting the environment and biodiversity. Same time, make sure we're not siting right next to an MPA or in an MPA. I know that sounds crazy, but stranger things have happened. We want to make sure we're doing public health risk reduction. We know seafood can be safe if it's very, very clean, it's very healthy. And so we want to make sure that, you know, that aquaculture facilities are run in a proper way, that they're safe. And as you already heard me talk about before, things like, you know, marine debris issues that could come from poorly run aquaculture facilities, entanglement issues. These are things that have happened all over the world. They're not something that are a maybe, might be, but if we don't do it right, those are concerns. So all of these can be overcome, but we have to have a really strong and standardized approach to dealing with it.
Thanks, Mark. Let me also, you know, give Terry and Peter a chance to respond here. Again, we're talking about the key policy challenges facing the growth of the sustainable aquaculture industry in the U.S.
The only thing I think I would add, I was talking about the Seafood Act, and one thing we like about it is it does set up permitting, monitoring, and regulatory options for government offshore aquaculture in the US. So that would be specific to federal waters offshore. I don't know exactly how that would encompass other types of aquaculture. I recognize most of the aquaculture we're doing here in the United States is near shore or on land. But I guess from a broader perspective of looking into the future, that's something that, yeah, it's necessary. We can't even do testing at this point without that. I feel like I've heard that there are institutions that want to do more research into that. And it's a struggle at this point because we don't have the regulatory framework.
Sure. Terry?
I would just add to what Mark and Peter have said is that one of the challenges that I think any industry faces is the transparency for the permitting and making sure the public and everyone knows what's happening all along the way and that decisions are made in an open and transparent process. They know what to expect. They know what the hurdles are. They know what they can do to help with that. And I think in the bigger picture of things and kind of just settling it all down, that's the key. You need to know why somebody says yes and why somebody says no for something. And aquaculture is exactly like agriculture. It just happens to be in the sea or in tanks on the land. So it's
and they don't get funding the same way agriculture does. That's the difference.
Yes,
Fair point.
Hey Jade, one more thing is that there is that nexus between state and federal. That's another place that I think has room for improvement quite dramatically is making sure that, I just listed 8 state agencies. There's multiple federal agencies as well. It's not just NOAA, it's Army Corps of Engineers as well. And so that's something, you can imagine for anyone applying, that's really rough to go through all that with all those various different agencies. And then the other thing, which is such an Alt-C thing that I feel like I have to bring it up, is that, there is this move now for aquaculture from the standpoint of carbon sequestration benefits. And that's something that really all the agencies need to start thinking about. How do you deal with that? Do you deal with it in a different way than you would with aquaculture for food? And that's something I think that's an important thing that needs to be addressed really, really soon, because there's a lot of startups, et cetera, including at Alt-C, that are looking specifically at aquaculture for that purpose.
And yeah, even beyond, carbon sequestration, I'm thinking of seaweed in particular, the industrial uses or for biofuels, and yeah, it only gets more complicated as we see all the different uses and potential benefits.
Good point.
And on that note, I think there is very much, I think, at least what I've seen, let me say, and then please you all chime in with your opinion, at the federal level as well as at the state level, there is generally this recognition of the potential for sustainable aquaculture. As you said, policy still seems to be catching up to that recognition. At the federal level, there has been the Aquacultural Opportunity Areas Initiative, which I'm going to ask Terry to give us a bit of a primer on. And this initiative is intended to accelerate sustainable aquaculture in geographies most suited to it around the country. And Terry, I was hoping you could give us, a brief primer on this initiative as well as the progress that's been made to date.
Absolutely. So thank you for that question. And not wanting to get too much in the weeds, definitely happy to do it after the fact if needed, but really aquaculture opportunity areas are going to help expand the economic opportunities in coastal and rural areas. So these sites are, and that is all part of helping to increase the nation's seafood supply. And what we're looking at in these areas is what is the best available science to figure out the appropriate space for sustainable aquaculture to exist wherever that aquaculture opportunity might be. And currently we have, NOAA is working on aquaculture opportunities in the Gulf of Mexico, in California, and then us up in Alaska. So we've got 3 different, aquaculture opportunity areas under review, going through the different phases. And they're very complicated phases to look at all of those science questions to figure out, is that plot of land right there in that ocean the best thing for everything, or is it only for seaweed, or would it be best for fish, or would it be best for shellfish, whatever that is, and help them figure that out. And it's going to help us as an agency help to make sure that we're minimizing interactions with other users. So remember, we've got shipping out there. If we're looking at federal aquaculture opportunity areas, we've got a lot of shipping, we've got fishing, we have subsistence activities, military, etc. So all of those things also are part of that mapping, right? So what is the best use of that plot or that space for us to deal with? So that's kind of it in a nutshell. It is not a license, it's not pre-permitted site. It is, you know, an aquaculture can occur outside of an aquaculture opportunity area, but, you know, it is a space where a lot of science has gone in to say, this would be, you know, a great spot for this, if somebody wanted to bring that in, but it's not a guarantee.
Have you seen, oh, Mark, you came off mute there. I'll let you go before I jump in.
Oh, no, you can jump in first and I can follow.
Okay, great. I wanted to just see, you know, has there been fruit from some of the identification work that's been done to date with the AOAs, as far as have we seen states maybe jump into focusing on either, you know, streamlining permitting or committing funding, as Mark said, to help start getting those areas populated with aquaculture projects?
Mark, does this fit into the answer you were going to give? Go ahead.
No, I think you should go first, and then I'll talk a little bit about California.
Sure. So I think around the nation, yes, there are places where just the process of looking at aquaculture opportunity areas and creating an atlas and looking at all of the resources that are available within the federal systems to look at that space and to really analyze that space has been fruitful. And we don't have any of the aquaculture opportunity areas, you know, on the books right now, but we have a lot of them planned. And I will say that there are a number of companies looking and following closely for investments. Aquaculture is not a cheap endeavor, and it takes a lot of guts, and it takes funding in order to put something in the water. And clearly the folks that are investing in these opportunities and in these farms really are committed to it. And they see a value, and they see, you know, they think that they can help us increase seafood supply, but also, you know, they think they have the right technology in that location, and that it could be a win-win for all of us, which is great.
So I was just going to add a couple things, which is one for the audience, the modeling that is used to come up with the aquaculture opportunity areas is really, you know, the best that's kind of available right now for marine spatial planning. And so for that, you know, I give a lot of credit to NOAA for that. I mean, there's room for improvement. You know, I think it discounts certain things like proximity to pollution sources, which matter in a place like Southern California because of our deep water coastal sewage discharges that can be 4 or 5 miles offshore. You certainly don't want to have shellfish growing anywhere near that, as an example. And so that's one thing. The other thing that just sort of hit me in the California experience, and you know, while I was with the state, I must have met with them half a dozen times, with the people working on it, you know, scientists from throughout NOAA on this. And one of the things that just hit me was Department of Defense had a disproportionate impact on the mapping for Southern California. And so a lot of where you might think would be a decent site was off limits because of DOD. And so, you know, I don't know what the right number is, but looking at the map, which I haven't seen for about a month, but it sort of feels like 2/3 of the Southern California bight are off limits because of Department of Defense. And so that's a lot. And so that's something that, you know, maybe that's flexible, maybe it's not, but it wasn't for the purpose of doing the AOA modeling in a short period of time, which was what NOAA was under, you know, requirements to get things done pretty quickly in that regard. The other thing is it brings up very much the importance, again, of what I brought up before, of the need for coordination between state and federal agencies on this to really make sure that there's consistency between an AOA approach and what a state does. Because as an example, if the feds allow finfish off of a state that doesn't allow finfish aquaculture, that gets to a very awkward situation, and that's potentially what could happen here in California.
Double tap on that, because we haven't talked about it a ton, just kind of this bifurcation at times between finfish aquaculture and bivalve plant-based aquaculture. Do you see, states that right now maybe are a bit averse to even when done sustainably, fin fish aquaculture, developing new policies in this regard, as the importance of, sustainably farmed fish that often when it's imported, right, we're not quite sure necessarily where this fish is coming from, whereas if it's grown here in a well-regulated way, it can be a very different equation as far as how sustainable that the fish is. Could you maybe just speak a little bit to this dichotomy between, again, bivalves, plants, fin fishing, and if you see any sort of policy developments that could alleviate concerns particularly around fin fishing?
I mean, the state perspective is you got to crawl before you can walk. And there really is no aquaculture program that's systematic right now. And wanting to have a sustainable aquaculture program that minimizes public health and environmental impacts, that's why the focus is on shellfish and algae. And it doesn't mean that forever there will never be finfish, but it's more like, let's get this done right. Let's have a robust program that's successful. And then and only then let's have further conversations on whether or not it makes sense for finfish. And in the interim, doing things on land makes sense. Peter, you talked about relationships with restaurants. I don't know, people know my brother used to be the top food critic in the nation, Jonathan Gold. He passed away like 5-6 years ago. And I can tell you one of his favorite restaurants, which right now is top 5, maybe top 2 in LA, is a place called Holbox. And they have, if you haven't eaten there, it's one of the few places you can actually get land-based aquaculture, sustainable aquaculture shrimp. Just amazing shrimp tacos if you haven't had them, among other things. And so it shows it can be done. Unfortunately, the price point for that is really high, but it is something that can be done. It'll be really interesting to see how Nordic Aqua Farms does with the yellowtail, and how much that scales, because they're going big, and sort of to see how affordable it is to do something land-based versus in the ocean.
Terry, I see you came off mute.
I did. I want to make sure folks understand from the NOAA fisheries perspective, aquaculture is aquaculture, be it fish, shellfish, seaweeds, and we're going to be looking to protect and to conserve our trust resources throughout the entire. It doesn't matter if it's for a fish, it doesn't matter if it's for a sea cucumber or an oyster or a clam or bull kelp. That's what we're going to be looking at, because that is our role. Now, the state obviously has jurisdiction over other things, but from the federal standpoint, those are the things that we're going to be looking for, is to make sure our the Endangered Species Act, et cetera, are all being protected and have that. And I did ask Dorothy to pop something into the chat, because I can't do it as a panelist, but in Washington this week, we published a multi-year project, which just helps outline and explain in Washington waters alone what the complex process is for getting a permit to do aquaculture, shellfish aquaculture in our state. It looks simplistic. It is not simplistic. It can take a very long time to get through. And I know in California, the process is very similar. In California, there is a group that meets of the federal services and the states that get together and talk about issues. We have the same group here in Washington, and we all get together and we have the local government, the tribes, the state agencies, and the federal agencies coming together to talk about not permit streamlining, but permit efficiencies. So, if a map is required for one entity, a state agency, can that same map be used for a federal agency? If not, how do we make it so that the producer only has to put in one map and not 15 maps? That is the goal. And that project actually came out of something that NOAA created, which is the National Shellfish Initiative. And Washington State was one of the first to adopt that initiative through our governor, and has set a series of goals and things. It's been renewed a second time. And we have a work plan that we do both at the state and the county and the tribal and federal level to support shellfish aquaculture and shellfish restoration and other things, education, etc. So, but that map might just give folks who aren't familiar with the permitting process, a chance to take a small peek of another state and what they go through.
Thank you. And no, you're already getting to, I think, or at least I'm interpreting it as what might be a response to my next question, but I imagine you'll have more to say as well. So thinking beyond the AOAs, which are, this fantastic policy that seems to be starting to have a catalytic effect. What are the most promising policy solutions, whether, they are concrete ways of, increasing coordination across jurisdictions, streamlining permitting, innovative funding, education initiatives, all the things you sort of touched on that could be good. Are there concrete examples that you can refer to that you believe either are already or will accelerate aquaculture as a practice, as an industry? Just hoping we could share with folks some of the concrete ways, that policy solutions are looking to tackle the many obstacles that have been identified. And actually, Mark, I will start with you on this one.
Okay, Jade. So this is I've pretty much been alluding to in the previous answers. It's finally up to California to step up and do this in a systematic way rather than a bunch of one-offs. And so hopefully that aquaculture action plan will be done by early next year. It was held up by a number of different things, not worth getting into. But the bottom line is it really needs to move forward for all the reasons that we've talked about before. And it's the key is to do it in a way that isn't just policy, but actually has some funding tied to it. And to give another example of what the Ocean Protection Council has done in that regard, they've been setting sea level rise policy for the state, but it's only been recently that the state has also funded coastal resilience projects to make sure that it's not just words in a report or a policy, but you're actually going to see some action. And that action plan needs to include all components that I was talking about, including, in essence, a business plan. Like, how are we going to grow aquaculture, sustainable aquaculture in California? And that's something that is just has not been done effectively in the state and needs to. Monitoring is one of the hardest things to fund. Terry, you can attest to that, being at NOAA, knowing how the whims of Congress can have an impact on monitoring in any given year, when the reality is the importance of monitoring is more important than ever with the changing climate. And so that's something that is really critical. Can you imagine you do all this aquaculture siting effort, and then you end up siting in areas, and Terry, I bet you experienced this already, that are highly vulnerable to ocean acidification. And so then you have a very unsuccessful shellfish aquaculture fishery because of those issues, right? And so we need to be extremely smart about that in making sure that we're doing an aquaculture in a manner that isn't vulnerable to ocean acidification in a major way. A lot of times you see growth of eelgrass directly proximate to aquaculture in vulnerable areas to ocean acidification for that exact purpose. So that's something that I really want to highlight as important, is that plan. And I'm glad that Fish and Game Commission has come up with their public interest determination criteria for leasing, because now there's a very transparent public way for the public to really voice whatever concerns they have. You still have to go through environmental review, California Environmental Quality Act, et cetera. But this is something that makes this a public process in a positive way. And the last thing on the plan that is just so important is, because it shouldn't take 3 years for an applicant to get their application approved, is there has to be a way to coordinate much better multi-agency and get permit approvals near the same time, in parallel, not in sequence, as much as possible. And so that's you often hear that sort of permit streamlining approach. It's not to weaken any environmental regulations. It's just basically to get your answers much more quickly on what you need to do to have a more sustainable aquaculture project. So those are some of the things that need to be done and done quickly.
Thanks, Mark. Terry, I see you coming off mute, and you're already starting to answer this question. So sorry to interrupt your flow.
I was just going to add to what Mark just said, is at NOAA Fisheries, you can ask us ahead of time. Come in for a pre-consultation with one of our consultation biologists. Let's sit down and talk about your project. I'm not a consultation biologist. I'm a regional aquaculture coordinator, but I can introduce you to your person. If you're in California, it's Celia Barroso, who will be starting this summer. In other regions, if you're there, I can introduce you to their person there. And they can get you in consultation with a consultation biologist. They can walk through the permit, the application that you're putting forward as if you're in the industry, and help you identify some of the trouble spots that you're going to want to smooth over before you even enter into a state or a Corps process, Army Corps of Engineer process. And that really is helpful. I know in Washington, when I speak with our consultation biologists and others, one of the things that I'm seeing as part of the group that I help oversee with our state aquaculture coordinator, and California is very lucky. They also have a state aquaculture coordinator, and that's Randy Lovell. And Randy is a great resource. If anybody has a question, I would say Randy's one of the first calls. Celia would be my second call if you're in California, to help a producer understand what's going on and what might go on, but also lead them to the resources they need. But we're working hard to make sure that any monitoring that's required as a consultation process, if there's a question about something that, perhaps NOAA needs more science on, to make sure that something isn't causing a problem or something. And so I see in different conditions of things, the Corps will put in, a condition that will help not just our agency, but multiple agencies. And it's only one condition. And it's something that's, generally something that producer can do relatively easily. Collecting data just to collect data is not something our agency is, interested in. We want to make sure that it's appropriate. It's going to help us answer current or future, basically more future questions that we might have as things continue. Yeah.
Thank you, Terry. It sounds like you yourself are a policy solution, living embodiment thereof. Peter, I just want to give you a chance to respond as well before we turn to some Q&A from the audience.
Yes, I mentioned the Seafood Act already. We talked about how that might be something people can keep their eyes on, policymakers and some of the attendees here, because it helps set up the framework for the permitting and the monitoring for offshore aquaculture, and then also some of those pilot testing, right, to collect data to better understand how we can advance that type of industry. But one other component about that legislation that I think is worth sharing is that it sets up a grant program to help minority serving educational institutions. How can we advance the industry while also making it equitable? And so it establishes aquaculture centers of excellence to help build up the workforce, create more curriculum, create opportunities to advance career paths, because that's going to be a challenge as well. I mean, we kind of already talked about how we're importing so much of our seafood, and we've been framing it as a big barrier has been the regulations and the management, but it's costs as well. And labor is a big part of that, which is not an easy problem to solve. It's a complex issue for sure. And it's been really interesting even just to be a part of this webinar to learn more about the nuances of it and what's going on.
Thanks, Peter. Great. Well, we already have a few questions dropped into the chat, but now I just want to encourage anyone in the audience, if you have questions for the panelists, to please drop them in the Q&A, kind of those bubbles next to each other, not the proper chat, which I believe we actually folks may not have access to given the webinar format of this Zoom, but you'll see there's a little Q&A icon at the bottom. Click it, drop your questions in, we'll get to them. Sorry, before I do, Terry, I see you came off mute. So was there a final note you wanted to add?
I did, because Peter said something that just tugged at my heart and that I think we all need to remember. There's nothing better than knowing the fisherman that caught your fish, or the farmer that produced your oyster and your clam, your gooey duck, your seaweed. It's a community. A lot of these operations are in rural communities. This is the economic driver there. This is the community. And it's really important to know who these people are. Farm to table is more than just words. It really is a way of life, and a great way of life that we in the US, have in spits and spots, but could have much, much more. And knowing these folks is really important, and understanding how much pride they take in their work and creating these products for us.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So again, if you have any questions for the panelists, please go ahead and drop them into the Q&A. Looks like we have a couple. So I'm going to start, because this is definitely a fair question. And I'm going to tweak it slightly, so audience member know that I'm just trying to make this question as usable as possible for the audience. So are there, policies that apply to agriculture, so on-land farming, that we can borrow or we should be looking to for inspiration? Mark, you already highlighted some of the key differences between how agriculture and aquaculture is treated, but definitely worthwhile question. Are there some sort of inspirations we might be able to take from agriculture?
Sunil, one of the things I would like to highlight is when we put together the sustainable aquaculture principles for the state, we had CDFA there. And it was for this exact reason where we're going like, this really does fit into aquaculture. And, I'm hoping maybe, Terry, you've got some insight here on, are there states that have been able to sort of bridge that and get the state aquaculture agency, or even federal, USDA to start playing a bigger role here, because it's food production, and we kind of failed at doing it. Like, we tried. I mean, we must have had half a dozen meetings, et cetera, but it wasn't, with all the other priorities that CDFA was dealing with, it just was not something that seemed that interesting to them. Whereas where we were very pleasantly surprised that state public health was hugely interested and was actually doing a lot more than we had any idea, from the standpoint of making sure that we were having food safety there. But I think Sunil's point is a really good one, because I think the funding issues might change dramatically, and especially if you're talking about food production on land through mariculture. That's makes it, I think, even more of something where you would expect the CDFA to play a much larger role. But right now, they haven't really bit on doing it. But that's the sort of thing, I think, from the standpoint of a business model, needs to be taken pretty seriously.
Please, Terry.
So Mark kind of queued it up for me a little bit. In Washington State, we have an application known as a Joint Aquatic Resource Plan, Resource Project application. That form is used by our tribes, by our state entities, except for our Department of Health and our Fish and Wildlife Department, because they have slightly different permits that are required, and our NOAA partners. So the Army Corps, US Fish, EPA, at NOAA. And I will say that process is what we highlighted in the map that I'm hoping Dorothy can pop up, or that flow chart that Dorothy can pop up. Just that alone has really helped stop. It is a complicated document to fill out. Your extension and sea grant agents can help. Industry associations have helped folks fill those out, etc. And they've been helpful to folks. But there's always more that we can do. Obviously, the state aquaculture coordinators can help as much as they can, or refer you to people. There are also businesses coming up around those that can help you fill out your forms and get that. I will say some facilities, some operations are more complicated than others. Some are less complicated. Some go through much quicker. I have seen some in my previous life go through in a couple months. I've seen some go through in 10 years. It depends on the operation. It depends on the scale. It depends on the location. It depends on all of the parties that have a stake in what's going to happen. And here in Washington, that is a lot of the tribal, the federally recognized tribes, and their rights, and their, how they fish, how they culture, etc. So it can be all over the board. But obviously, one of the things I'm looking for in my new position is how within NOAA Fisheries can we make sure that we're taking the time we need to do the process correctly and to do everything, but we don't dilly-dally, and we've got enough staff and resources to actually look at the applications when they come in and get them in the process and in the system so that we can work through it. And I know across the nation, we're looking at that as well. And we've been very successful in Washington. We actually have an individual that works as a consultation biologist, and their only project is to look at aquaculture. They pull those off the line of all the consultations that come in. California also has someone that is dedicated to that in the NOAA system, and that she'll be pulling those off the line as well when they come forward. But we've got to get those into the system.
Unfortunately, not in the state system.
No, not in the state system, but in the federal system.
No, I understand. I'm just saying that's hard.
Yeah, and I will say, Mark, one of the things that you can see as we gather as a group, federally, state, tribal, and local, is that people see the synergies we're able to generate, and they see the excitement of being able to properly handle documents and permits in a way that's responsible and transparent to folks, and is not unnecessarily burdensome, you know, and that if people need resources, we all talk about those resources and identify them and work with others so that they know what resources are needed at the state level to help get these documents, these permits through the system. You know, if one person is doing something and you really need 12, yeah, you're going to have a backup, right?
Right. No, and that's what I'm bringing up to people here, which is even with the best of intentions at Fish and Wildlife, they literally have no staff that are funded to work on aquaculture. And so if you don't have dedicated staff working on the permitting component of this, or the monitoring or the compliance effort, then your program's not going to be what it should be. Coastal Commission has managed to do a decent job because of the importance of it but you know, it goes beyond that, obviously, State Lands Commission, et cetera. And it just, we don't have that sort of coordination yet, and hopefully the state will achieve that sometime in the near future. And just like I'm sure it's not super easy all the time for NOAA to coordinate with the Army Corps as well. So that can be time consuming too.
All very forward-looking, much of what we're discussing today. I want to, just because I think this is actually a really great question to spend a few minutes diving into, is really just, you know, what do we even mean by sustainable aquaculture? Great question from Sunil. You know, on-land farming, right, that requires electricity. There's so many different aspects of what go into the definition of what could be sustainable aquaculture. And Peter, I thought you might be particularly well positioned to speak to this, giving me advice. You know, what are the aspects of this industry that you're looking at when you're advising folks on the most sustainable approaches that they could be taking?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in with my work, when I'm doing sustainability reports for different customers, when I say customers, I mean businesses essentially. A lot of it is environmental data that they're collecting in terms of more traditional, I guess, aquaculture. So before working for this company, I used to be with Seafood Watch at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. They do the ratings program. You have eco certifications, right? So with every seafood item that we sell to a company, it's sharing data about where it's coming from. So a lot of times it's the fishing or farming method, it's the species, the country of origin, FAO area. Is it in a fishery improvement project or aquaculture improvement project? What are those certifications? And so it's a great question regarding what about those other environmental inputs aside from what these environmental organizations are looking at. And actually, I would say it's been shifting more to look at social, right? I think it was Jade that touched a little bit on, you know, when we're importing so much of our seafood, how are the people there being treated? Unfortunately, especially with wild seafood, when you're on the high seas, there's a lot higher risk of human rights abuses. So that is a great question. I know when I was at Seafood Watch, they did launch a carbon emissions tool to dig into that more. And I was actually just trying to pull it up while you guys were talking, because that is a great question when you're looking at comparing other inputs aside from your traditional like feed, right, for aquaculture. I think when it comes to land-based aquaculture, it's probably more of a concern around water use, but I'm not really equipped to speak to that necessarily.
Mark,
So,
please go ahead.
yeah, so I would add a couple things, which is, you know, I know we're running out of time, but Bill Monning in 2009 had a bill, AB 1217, that really would have gotten at this perfectly. It was to create a sustainable seafood program for the state of California. I sat on that for 2+ years. We had final recommendations that were ready to go, and then they got killed by the seafood industry and some large restaurants. And it was a shame, because honestly, I think it's set back the state a decade. And I think it was because maybe they felt it was going too far. But all those issues that Peter just brought up, carbon emissions, et cetera, were talked about. I mean, we had situations where, it was more environmental to import seafood than to have like wild, California market squid caught in Monterey Bay, because you had to send it all the way back to China to get processed and then have it come back, because we had no processing in the state of California. That's nuts. But that just showed you sort of the state of where things are. And I couldn't agree with you more, Peter. Sustainability, from the standpoint of equity, economy, and the environment. It's got to be all of those things. You can't have habitat destruction. You can't have, people's human rights basically abused. We've seen, irresponsible aquaculture that has been polluting, that has led to marine mammal entanglement, that has led to invasive species, or just being released, tens of thousands of raised organisms. Things like that just can't happen in sustainable aquaculture, and there's no reason they have to. And so we shouldn't have water pollution problems as well, which can happen if you have poor circulation. We've seen coastal habitat destruction all over the world because of aquaculture. So those are the things that we're really trying to avoid here. And then on land, one of the reasons why people are sort of intrigued by on land is because you can have circulating water systems that treat the water, take the nutrients and the pathogens out. And so that can be something that, in the long run could be beneficial. And so it's not easy, it's not cheap, but those are some of the things that sort of come to mind in true sustainability.
Carrie, I'll maybe give you the last word here before I close this out. Looks like you might have wanted to add something.
Well, I peeked ahead, and there's one more question that talked about, it talked about some of the USDA work and some of the NOAA work and things. And instead of diving into those various acts, and happy to at a different time, I think the important thing is on the West Coast in particular, and all around the nation, USDA, US Department of Agriculture, and NOAA, US Fish, EPA, all work together. So on the West Coast, we have a Pacific shellfish breeding program managed by USDA, and it's down at in Newport, Oregon, on NOAA facilities, and they provide some of the stuff. NOAA has other expertise. We all work together. We're a partnership. We're not going to duplicate. So if we're looking at sustainable aquaculture, we're also looking as agencies of not duplicating each other's work and doing those things that are unique to us. And together we form a really nice union that can move things further, especially when we come to research, etc. And it's quite amazing to really see it up close and personal. Some of you are familiar with extension agents. Those are the folks that are working through universities, through USDA. Sea grant agents are part of NOAA. Extension and sea grant agents work together, just like the NOAA staff and faculty, NOAA staff and researchers work together with USDA staff and researchers. We all work together. And that's the best thing for our coast, is to figure out where those good solutions are, and that we can all have, rules and things that fit for the promotion and for the sustainability of aquaculture in our region, because it's important. We only produce about 38% of our nation's production here. The Northeast, or the upper coast, Maine, Connecticut, that eastern seaboard is 40%, and the Gulf's about 22%. We have so much more we can do out here if we do it smartly. And people are going to be watching us all to make sure we're doing it smartly, and we are. And we're going to make sure they know every step of the way.
Thank you, Terry, for closing us out with those thoughts. And yes, I'm so thankful to each of you, each of our panelists, for being here today. Peter, Terry, Mark, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for tuning in. Sorry if we weren't able to get to your questions, but hopefully we'll catch you at another webinar soon and you'll have a chance to ask then. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Still recording.
Sorry.